The sun had barely set over the sleepy town of Briarville, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Traffic was light, as usual, and people went about their business with little more than the hum of everyday life. But for Jasmine, today wasn't like any other day. She was running late, again, and the stress was mounting. As a software engineer, she'd just wrapped up a grueling project at work and was headed home to unwind before another early start. But fate had other plans. She was driving her prized possession, a sleek, black Hyundai Elantra. It wasn't just a car to her, it was the result of years of hard work, countless late nights, and sacrifices. To Jasmine, it was a symbol of success in a world that often overlooked people like her. But she couldn't have known that tonight, it would also become a symbol of defiance. As she turned onto Maple Street, she noticed the flashing lights of a patrol car in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. The officer had been following her for a few blocks now, and Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had done nothing wrong, but that never seemed to matter when it came to the way some people viewed her, especially in a town with a reputation for racial tension. The last time she'd been pulled over here, she was given a ticket for a taillight that wasn't even broken. Tonight, her instincts told her this would be no different. She slowly pulled over to the curb, her heart pounding in her chest. The officer got out of his patrol car, his uniform crisp and his boots gleaming under the streetlights. As he approached, she noticed his cold demeanor and the way his eyes narrowed when they met hers. "Evening, ma'am," he said in a flat tone. "License and registration." Jasmine handed over her documents, her fingers trembling slightly as she did. She'd been in this situation too many times before to be naive, but the officer's hostility still stung. He glanced at her ID, his eyes scanning her name, then her face. Jasmine held her breath, waiting for him to find something to pick apart, anything to justify the sense of unease that had settled deep in her gut. "Everything in order?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long look at the car, then back at her. A strange flicker of recognition crossed his face, but it wasn't a look of familiarity, it was something darker. Something she couldn't place, but knew instinctively was bad. Then, without warning, he reached for her door handle, yanking it open with a sharp motion. "Step out of the car, ma'am," he ordered, his voice now colder, more commanding. "Excuse me?" Jasmine's voice cracked slightly as she processed the abruptness. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You're under suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle," he said, his tone growing more forceful with each word. "Step out." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. "What?" she gasped. "My car's not stolen." The officer ignored her protests. He reached inside the car, unlocking the door from the inside and pulling her out with surprising force. Jasmine stumbled back, the heel of her shoe digging into the dirt as she tried to keep her balance. She tried to speak, to explain, but the officer wasn't listening. He was already beginning to inspect the car, his eyes scanning every inch of it as if he expected to find some hidden evidence of wrongdoing. "I didn't steal my car," Jasmine shouted, her voice rising in desperation. "I bought this fair and square." But it was no use. The officer had already made up his mind. His actions were swift and harsh as he started to tow her car away, ignoring Jasmine's pleas. Her hands clenched into fists, but she felt powerless. The humiliation was suffocating. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just another routine traffic stop, but to Jasmine, it was a violation of everything she had worked for. As she watched the cop's cruiser pull her car away, an overwhelming surge of anger and frustration boiled inside her. This was not just about a car. It was about something much deeper. She had seen it in the way the officer looked at her, in the way he treated her like a criminal without any proof, simply because of who she was. She was a young black woman in a predominantly white town, and that, apparently, was all the justification he needed. But Jasmine wasn't just some victim who would quietly accept what had happened. She was a problem solver. A tech genius. And she wasn't about to let this slide. Behind the calm facade, Jasmine's mind was already racing. As the officer began to drive away with her car, she quickly reached for her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly, typing in a series of commands. This wasn't just any phone, it was her lifeline, a tool she had designed herself. Using a remote access program she had installed in her car system, she connected to the vehicle's onboard computer and activated a special feature, a device she'd installed just for emergencies like this. It wasn't just a tracker. It was a game changer. In seconds, the officer's patrol car was on its way out of town, unaware that Jasmine had just initiated a sequence that would turn everything upside down. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She wasn't just going to get her car back. She was going to make sure the officer would never forget what had happened tonight. As the minutes ticked by, Jasmine's mind raced with possibilities. She couldn't rely on the police to fix this. No one would believe her story. They never did. But she had the power of technology on her side, and she knew how to use it. The officer wouldn't know what hit him. The night air felt heavy as Jasmine stood there, watching the flashing lights of the police car fade into the distance. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. She was alone now, standing in the middle of the street, but her mind was already 1,000 miles away, focused on the problem at hand. Her car, the symbol of her hard work and determination, was gone, snatched away without reason or cause. She had always known that Briarville wasn't a perfect place, but this was different. This was personal. She didn't know if it was the officer's hatred or his ignorance that fueled his actions, but it didn't matter now. What mattered was that she had to take control of the situation, and fast. Jasmine stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the moment sink in. She felt a mixture of rage and disbelief. How many times had she been told to just be patient, to let things work themselves out? But Jasmine knew better. In a town like this, patience often meant silence, and silence was something she couldn't afford. She couldn't let this incident slide, couldn't allow it to be buried beneath the apathy that often accompanied such injustices. Her fingers gripped her phone tighter, as though the device might somehow provide answers. The custom software she had designed for situations like this, well, it was more than just a remote tracker. She had used her skills as a programmer to create a hidden backdoor into the car systems, a way to control almost every aspect of it remotely. It wasn't just for safety, it was a precaution she'd put in place after hearing too many stories about corrupt officers or malicious individuals abusing their power. She had learned from the mistakes of others, and now that knowledge was about to pay off. Jasmine turned and quickly walked back toward her apartment building, her mind already processing the next steps. As she climbed the stairs, she ran through the options in her head, weighing each one carefully. She couldn't just go to the police, they had proven themselves to be part of the problem. She could try to contact a lawyer, but that would take time. No, Jasmine needed to act fast. She needed to expose what had just happened to her, to make sure this wasn't just another statistic in a long list of unpunished abuses of power. Once inside her apartment, she immediately sat down at her desk. The familiar hum of her computer provided a sense of comfort in the midst of chaos. It was a small space, nothing luxurious, but it was hers, and in that moment, it was the only place where she felt she had any control. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she booted up the program she had been working on for months. It was her greatest achievement, something she'd poured hours into, and now, she realized, it was about to become her weapon. She opened a secure connection to her car system and began the process of initiating a series of commands that would alter everything. Her plan was simple, but effective. First, she would disable the GPS tracking system in the officer's vehicle so he couldn't report her actions. Next, she would trigger a disruption in his dashboard cameras, an automatic shutdown, cutting off the evidence of his misconduct. Finally, she would activate a hidden live feed from the car's own cameras and microphone, sending a direct stream to a hidden server she had set up earlier that day. It would be an untraceable, real-time broadcast that no one could ignore. And neither would anyone else. As Jasmine typed the final command, she paused. A thought occurred to her. Was she doing the right thing? The weight of her decision pressed on her chest, She wasn't just exposing the officer, she was also putting herself in the crosshairs. If this backfired, if the officer or anyone else discovered what she had done, it could have serious consequences for her career, her freedom, her safety. But she knew deep down that this wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about taking down a single cop. This was about standing up to a system that was broken, and if her actions could shine a light on that, then it was worth the risk. She pressed enter. The screen flashed as the commands were executed. Jasmine watched as the feed from her car's cameras came to life, transmitting a live broadcast to an anonymous network. She smiled grimly as she saw the officer's body cam flicker, then cut to static. The officer wouldn't know what hit him. In a few short minutes, his racist actions would be on full display for the world to see. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. It wasn't enough to simply expose him, though. She needed to make sure this wasn't swept under the rug like so many other cases. This wasn't just about a stolen car anymore, it was about making a stand. It was about changing the way people saw the world. Jasmine couldn't stop now. She had taken the first step, and there was no going back. As she sat there, the sound of her phone buzzing on the desk startled her. It was a text message from an unknown number. "We've got it. Keep going." Jasmine's eyes widened. She didn't know who had sent the message, but the implications were clear: someone else was watching. Someone who understood what she was trying to do. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard for just a moment. This was bigger than just her now. There was a network of people out there who cared about justice, about truth. She wasn't alone in this fight. She glanced at the clock. The officer would be back soon. But by the time he got there, it would be too late. Jasmine had already taken control. Outside her window, the distant hum of the officer's patrol car could be heard as he slowly made his way back into town, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Jasmine took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the screen one last time. Her pulse quickened, but her resolve only strengthened. The game had changed, and she was the one calling the shots now. What would happen next was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain: Jasmine had just begun a fight that would change everything. And no one, especially not the officer who had wronged her, would ever forget her name. Jasmine didn't have much time. The reality of what she'd just done was starting to sink in, and with it, a heavy sense of urgency. The officer was bound to return soon, but this wasn't just about her car, or even about confronting him. This was bigger. Much bigger. She had just exposed a piece of the deep-rooted corruption that festered in her community, but she knew that if she wasn't careful, it could be twisted and used against her. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about survival. And Jasmine wasn't sure how far she was willing to go to make things right. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she watched the feed from her car's hidden cameras. The officer had parked at a local diner, his patrol car still visible in the shot. For a moment, he seemed unaware of the tech storm that had just swept over him. But Jasmine knew that wouldn't last. He would eventually realize that his body cam had gone offline and that the car had been tampered with. When that moment came, he wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. She had to move quickly, make sure the information was out there before he could cover his tracks. Jasmine picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It was a contact from her college days, someone who had worked in media and had connections in the world of online activism. They weren't friends anymore, but Jasmine had a feeling this might be one of those moments where old alliances could come in handy. The phone rang twice before someone answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but distant. Jasmine hesitated before responding. "Hey, it's Jasmine. I know it's been a while, but I need your help." "Jasmine? Wow, long time. What's going on?" The voice on the other end was more skeptical than warm. "I've got something big. Something important. I need you to get it out there. Now." There was a pause. Jasmine could hear the rustling of papers or maybe the tapping of a keyboard. "All right, slow down. What exactly are we talking about here?" I can't explain everything right now, Jasmine said, keeping her voice low, but I've got a live feed showing police misconduct. The kind of stuff they'll bury if I don't get it out there. You're the only person I trust who can get this in front of the right eyes. Her old contact didn't respond immediately. Jasmine could hear the faint sound of a chair creaking as they shifted in their seat. She felt her stomach churn with nerves. Was this the right move? But she knew she didn't have a choice. Finally, the voice returned. All right, send me the link. I'll make sure it gets to the right people. She didn't waste another second. Jasmine quickly forwarded the video feed and the background information she had on the officer, making sure to mask her own identity with layers of encryption. If things went south, she didn't want anyone tracking her back to the source. Once the message was sent, she sat back in her chair and let out a breath she didn't even realize she was holding. This was the moment. The video would go viral. The officer would lose control, and the town would be forced to reckon with its ugly truth. But as she stared at the screen, a new thought crept into her mind. What would happen after? Once the world saw what she had done, once the story hit the news, there would be no turning back. Jasmine felt the weight of what she had just unleashed. There was no telling how far this would go. The officer wouldn't be the only one coming after her. The system, the very people who had allowed this kind of injustice to go unchecked for so long, would strike back with everything they had. And it wasn't just about the police anymore. It was about the town, the people who had silently accepted the status quo, the friends and family who would be forced to choose sides. Her phone buzzed again. A new message from her contact, it's out. The feed's live. You did good. Jasmine stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It was out of her hands now. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. The phone rang again, this time a different number. Jasmine. It was a voice she didn't recognize, but it was calm, almost too calm. We know what you've done. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't expected them to come after her so soon. She could feel her breath quicken. Who is this? We're not here to hurt you, the voice continued, with an unnerving politeness, but you've stirred up a lot of attention. We know what you're trying to do. And if you want to protect yourself, we suggest you stop now. Walk away before this goes any further. You've already gone too far. Jasmine's mind raced, trying to decipher the message. Who was this person? What did they know? And what were they threatening? She tried to keep her voice steady, but the fear crept in anyway. I won't back down. This is bigger than me. You can't stop it. The voice didn't respond immediately, but she could feel the threat in the silence that followed. We'll see, they said finally, before hanging up. Jasmine felt a cold sweat form on the back of her neck. There were bigger forces at play here than just her and the officer. Whoever had just called was part of something much more sinister. Something that wasn't going to let her expose the truth without a fight. But in that moment, Jasmine made a decision. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to back down. The fight had just begun. As she prepared herself for what would come next, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Her actions had set something in motion, something that could change everything for her town, and for everyone who had been silenced for so long. She glanced at the window. The night was still and quiet. But beneath the surface, things were already starting to shift. And no matter what happened, Jasmine was ready to face it head-on. Because when you stand up for the truth, you never know who's watching. But you can be sure that the world will be listening. Jasmine spent the next few hours staring at her computer screen, watching as the live feed of her car's cameras streamed out into the digital void. Her heart was still racing, her mind spinning with 1,000 possibilities. The video had gone viral faster than she anticipated. Within minutes, news outlets were picking it up, and the hashtags were trending across every platform. The officer's actions, caught on camera, were now part of a larger conversation that Jasmine couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wished she could. She checked her phone again. The messages from her contact kept pouring in, confirming that people were watching, sharing, reacting. The story was spreading faster than she could keep up with. Her phone buzzed once more with a message from her old contact. It's getting bigger. This is going to make waves. Jasmine wasn't sure whether the weight of those words was something to celebrate or fear. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, and as much as she wanted to believe in the power of truth and justice, there was a part of her that feared what might come next. The sound of her front door opening interrupted her thoughts. She stood up quickly, her heart skipping a beat, as she turned toward the hallway. Her roommate, Zoe, entered the apartment, clearly flustered. "Jasmine, are you okay?" Zoe's voice was tense with concern as she shut the door behind her. Zoe was the kind of person who lived by logic, always trying to see things from every angle before making a decision. But there was no logic in this. What Jasmine had just done, what she had set in motion, wasn't something that could be neatly explained away. "I'm fine," Jasmine replied quickly, trying to force calm into her voice. But Zoe's eyes were sharp, and she could see right through her. She could tell something big was happening, something Jasmine was trying to keep under wraps. "Don't lie to me," Zoe said, walking over to Jasmine. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" Jasmine hesitated, unsure of how to explain it all. How could she tell Zoe that she had just set fire to a system that was bigger and uglier than they could have ever imagined? How could she tell her that her actions had just sparked a war that they were both now in the middle of? I exposed something," Jasmine said, finally finding the words. "I found something, and I put it out there. The officer, he took my car. He didn't have any right to do it. But it's bigger than just me. I had to show the world what's really happening here." Zoe stood there for a moment, taking in the information, her eyes narrowing as she processed it. "You exposed a cop for stealing your car? Jasmine, you've got to be careful. You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with." "I know," Jasmine replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But I couldn't just stand by and let this happen. It wasn't just about me. It's about everything. The corruption, the injustice. It's all connected. I couldn't let it go on any longer." Zoe sat down next to Jasmine, her gaze thoughtful. "So now what? Do you have a plan?" Jasmine looked at the screen again, watching as the video continued to spread. "I don't know. It's happening so fast, Zoe. The whole town's talking about it. People are reacting, sharing, commenting, but I don't know what's coming next." The silence between them felt heavier now. The weight of their conversation, the magnitude of what Jasmine had just unleashed, settled in like a heavy fog. Zoe, who had always been the rational one, was silent as she thought it over. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low and measured. "You've exposed something that's going to make people uncomfortable, Jasmine. And when people are uncomfortable, they react. Hard. You've got to be ready for it. There's no going back now." Jasmine nodded slowly, taking in her friend's words. The truth was, she wasn't sure she was ready. What she had done was already too big for her to control. The officer's misconduct was just the tip of the iceberg, and once that story hit, it would open the floodgates for everything else, the corruption, the cover-ups, the secrets that no one wanted to face. She had no idea how far it would go, how many more people were complicit, or how deep the roots of this problem truly ran. The sound of her phone buzzing again snapped her from her thoughts. A new message from her contact. "They're coming for you, Jasmine. Watch your back." Jasmine's blood ran cold. The message was simple, direct, but the implications were clear. She had made herself a target. The officer, the department, the system, they wouldn't let her get away with this. They would come after her, and they would do everything in their power to make her regret what she had done. But Jasmine knew she couldn't stop now. If she did, if she backed down, everything would have been for nothing. Zoe seemed to sense the shift in the room. She stood up, pacing back and forth. "We need to be smart about this, Jasmine. If they're coming after you, we have to think ahead. You can't just sit here and wait for them to make the first move. You need a plan, and it needs to be solid. Jasmine's mind raced. What could she do? How could she protect herself without backing down from her mission? What would happen to her life if everything went south? And yet, deep down, she knew that her only real option was to keep pushing forward, to stay ahead of the people who wanted to bury the truth. I've got something, Jasmine said suddenly, her voice gaining confidence. I can make them regret this. I've got more than just the footage. I've got access to more. More than they know. I can control the narrative. I can expose everything. Zoe stopped pacing and turned to face her. You can't do this alone, Jasmine. You need help. You need to trust people who can protect you. Jasmine's mind flickered back to the message she'd received earlier. I'm not alone, she said, more to herself than to Zoe. There's a group, a network of people who are already behind me. They know what's going on, and they're ready to fight. This doesn't stop with just my car. It's bigger. It's about everything. Zoe looked skeptical, but she didn't argue. All right. Then we need to get ahead of this. We need to make sure you're safe and make sure that when the truth comes out, it doesn't get buried again. You need to keep moving. And you need to be smart about it. Jasmine's resolve solidified. Zoe was right. The battle had just begun, and it wouldn't be easy. But she was in it now, and there was no turning back. She would fight. She would expose every inch of the corruption. And she would make sure that no one would ever forget the name Jasmine Hart again. The days that followed felt like a blur of adrenaline, uncertainty, and tension. Jasmine's life, which had once been routine and predictable, had become a whirlwind of messages, phone calls, and news updates. The video, the one where the officer had stolen her car, was still going viral. It was on the news, in social media feeds, and being discussed at dinner tables across the town. What had started as a single act of defiance had now become a movement. People were angry, confused, and some were downright scared. Jasmine could feel the collective shift in the air. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been pushed aside, ignored, or silenced for far too long. But with every wave of support came an equally strong tide of opposition. Not just from the officer, but from a network of powerful people whose grip on the community was about to be threatened. Jasmine knew it wouldn't be long before the system would come after her. The first signs had already appeared. Strange cars parked outside her apartment, anonymous messages warning her to stop, and unsettling phone calls that hung up as soon as she answered. But the more they tried to intimidate her, the stronger her resolve grew. She had set the wheels in motion, and there was no turning back. Her contact in the media world had been working overtime, getting the video out to influential figures and online activists who had a voice that could not be ignored. Within a few days, a larger group had emerged, people who weren't just outraged by the officer's actions, but who had been silently bearing witness to corruption for years. This group wasn't just interested in Jasmine's story, they had their own experiences, their own evidence, and their own struggles to share. It became clear that Jasmine had tapped into something far deeper than she had anticipated. But the opposition was swift and merciless. One evening, as Jasmine sat with Zoe in their apartment, reviewing the latest developments, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a message or a call from her contact, it was a private number. Her stomach churned as she picked up the phone. You've made a grave mistake, Jasmine, the voice on the other end said, smooth and calculating. You think you can expose us without consequences? You're playing with fire, and I can promise you, it won't end well for you. Jasmine's hand tightened around the phone, but she kept her voice calm. I'm not afraid of you. The voice chuckled, low and menacing. You should be. There's more at stake here than you realize. The video you put out, the people you're working with, you've started a firestorm that's already getting out of control. You won't be able to hide from this. We know everything about you, Jasmine. And we'll make sure you regret this. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to give in to fear. You don't scare me. The truth is out now. And it's not just about me anymore. People are waking up. People are talking. And you can't stop it. The voice on the other end was silent for a moment, then spoke with chilling calm. You'll wish you had never crossed us. We'll make sure you pay for this. And with that, the line went dead. She sat there, staring at the phone in her hand. The weight of the threat hung heavily in the room. But despite the danger, despite the fear creeping into the corners of her mind, Jasmine refused to back down. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. The fight wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who had suffered in silence, who had felt powerless, and who had watched corruption go unchecked for too long. She had sparked something powerful, and now it was her responsibility to see it through to the end. The following days were a blur of preparation, caution, and strategy. Jasmine moved quickly, using her tech skills to stay one step ahead of anyone who might be tracking her. She secured her communications, deleted any trace of her location, and relied on encrypted messages to stay in contact with the growing network of allies who were working behind the scenes. They were providing her with information, backing her up, and making sure she had what she needed to stay protected. But even with all the precautions, Jasmine knew that at any moment, they could find her. She wasn't naive enough to think she could stay hidden forever. Meanwhile, the public pressure on the officer had begun to mount. The story of the stolen car had turned into a larger scandal, and people were demanding answers. The more Jasmine shared, the more the officer's past became exposed. Evidence of previous incidents, misconduct, cover-ups, and even ties to criminal organizations began to surface, and soon, the story became too big to ignore. The pressure on the local government and police department grew unbearable. News outlets started to investigate, digging deeper into the officer's record, uncovering years of corruption that no one had been brave enough to address before. But as the walls closed in on the officer, it became clear that the real battle was just beginning. The people behind the system, the ones who had benefited from the corruption and manipulation for so long, were not going to go down without a fight. They had power, resources, and connections that Jasmine couldn't even begin to understand. They had already begun to mobilize, using their influence to discredit her, to paint her as a troublemaker, and to turn public opinion against her. They had deep pockets and even deeper motivations. One evening, as Jasmine reviewed some new information sent to her by her network, a sudden knock on the door sent her heart into overdrive. Her mind raced as she glanced toward the door. It was late, too late for a visitor. She crept quietly toward the peephole, her breath catching in her throat when she saw a uniformed officer standing outside. Her stomach twisted in dread. This wasn't a coincidence. Zoe stood beside her, fear etched across her face. What do we do? Jasmine's mind raced. The officer couldn't be here by accident. He had to know they were onto him, and now, he was coming for her. There was no time to waste. She motioned for Zoe to stay quiet as she backed away from the door. They had no choice but to act quickly. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't afford to hide. Not anymore. She grabbed her phone and sent a quick, encrypted message to her contact. They know. They're here. Make sure the info goes live now. Every angle. Don't wait for me. Her finger hovered over the send button. This was the moment. The last move. If they were coming for her, she had to make sure that her message, her truth, was out in the open for everyone to see. She wasn't going down alone. No matter how far the system reached, no matter how deep the lies ran, Jasmine was going to expose it all. With a deep breath, she hit send, feeling the weight of the decision settling into her chest. Whatever happened next, Jasmine had no regrets. She had ignited something that couldn't be extinguished. The truth would come out, one way or another. As the knock on the door grew louder, she turned to Zoe. It's time. Jasmine stood there, frozen for a brief moment, the reality of her situation settling in like a heavy fog. The knock on the door had escalated into something more persistent, almost as if whoever was on the other side knew the countdown was ticking down. She could hear the muffled sounds of footsteps outside, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't move. Zoe stood beside her, her face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. The silence that filled the apartment now felt suffocating, but Jasmine couldn't afford to show weakness. She had made it this far by staying calm under pressure, by thinking ahead, and by using every skill she had at her disposal. This was no different. Her fingers clenched around her phone, still glowing in her hand, waiting for the confirmation that her message had been sent. She glanced at Zoe and then back at the door, her mind already calculating the next move. "They're not just here for the car, Zoe," Jasmine whispered, her voice low but resolute. "This is bigger. They've known for days. We've been marked." Zoe nodded, her expression hardening. "So what do we do now? Do we fight? Run?" "We can't run, Zoe. If we run, it's over. They'll just keep chasing us, keep silencing people, and nothing will change." "I'm not running. We're not running." Jasmine moved quickly, her fingers flying over the keyboard of her phone as she pulled up encrypted files, records she had been saving, pieces of the puzzle that were going to expose the whole operation. She quickly arranged them, making sure everything was set to go public at the right moment. The last thing she needed was for this to disappear, for the system to bury it. She had already made her stand, and now, everything hinged on what would happen in the next few minutes. The door creaked open, a faint shadow appearing in the crack. Someone was trying to get in. Jasmine took a step back, her instincts screaming that this wasn't a simple visit. It wasn't a routine check. They knew exactly who she was. And if they were willing to come to her door, to escalate this so far, it meant they were desperate. Desperate people did dangerous things. A voice came from the other side, muffled but recognizable. "Jasmine Hart. Open the door." It was a calm, controlled voice, but there was a hint of authority in it that made Jasmine's skin crawl. "Tell them to leave, Zoe," Jasmine said, trying to steady her breath. Zoe hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. I don't know if that'll work, Jasmine. They're not here for a chat. We need to think this through." Jasmine's mind raced. There was no time to think. Whatever they wanted, whatever was about to happen, it was too late to back out now. "Just tell them you're not opening the door." Zoe swallowed hard but nodded. She stepped toward the door and called out, her voice steady, despite the tremble in her hands. "This is my home. You have no reason to be here. You need to leave." There was a long pause, before the voice on the other side responded, sharp and menacing. "You don't want to make this difficult. Open the door, and no one gets hurt." The threat hung in the air, and Jasmine could feel her pulse quicken. The officer on the other side wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he was trying to scare her into submission. But Jasmine had already made a decision. She had already chosen this path. There was no turning back now. She had exposed too much. If they thought she would fold now, they were wrong. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. "We're not opening the door," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You can't intimidate me. You can't stop the truth from coming out." The silence that followed was deafening. Jasmine and Zoe stood there, waiting, the sound of their breathing the only thing they could hear. But then, as if on cue, the door shook with a force that sent a jolt of fear through both of them. The officer was trying to break it down. Panic surged through Jasmine's chest, but she pushed it aside. They didn't have much time. She couldn't afford to be afraid now. She needed to act. Without thinking, she grabbed Zoe's hand and pulled her toward the back of the apartment. "Go. We need to get out of here, now." They rushed through the living room, but the sound of footsteps outside grew louder, more urgent. Jasmine's heart was in her throat, but she pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She couldn't allow herself to hesitate. Not now. As they reached the back door, Jasmine's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without stopping. A message from her contact, the video is live. It's out there, Jasmine. The whole town knows. For the first time since all of this started, she allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The truth was out. It couldn't be erased now. It had already taken on a life of its own. But they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. Zoe, we need to get to the safe house. Now. And don't look back. Zoe nodded, fear and determination blending in her eyes. They sprinted through the back alley, cutting through the shadows of the night. They couldn't risk taking the main roads. Every second was critical. As they ran, Jasmine's mind raced with thoughts of the officer, the corrupt system that had been uncovered, and what would happen next. The officer was just one part of the machine, and he was just the first to be exposed. But there were others, people with more power, more influence, and a network that stretched further than she could have ever imagined. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. When they reached the safe house, Jasmine collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with exhaustion, but her mind still on overdrive. She couldn't relax, couldn't let her guard down, not until she knew she had protected the truth, the evidence, and the people who were now depending on her. Zoe sat beside her, her face pale but focused. What now? Jasmine stared at the phone in her hand. The messages, the notifications, everything was pouring in faster than she could process. The truth was spreading, and people were starting to rally. But the road ahead would be dangerous. Her next move had to be perfect. We keep going, Jasmine said, her voice steady, unwavering. We keep pushing forward, no matter what. The world is watching now. And we can't stop until the entire system is exposed. In that moment, as the weight of what was to come settled in, Jasmine knew that there was no going back. She had lit the spark that could burn it all down. And no matter what, she would make sure that the truth would rise from the ashes.